Good morning, everybody. Happy to see you. And I want to announce at the beginning, and I hope I will remember to announce again, this is the Passover Thursday morning Torah. So next Thursday, there will not be a Thursday morning Torah. We will all be observing Passover instead of talking about it. But this morning, we will be talking about it instead of observing it. So I hope that is clear. I'm going to talk about a few different things about Passover, and I hope that you will find them helpful and useful, maybe to say at the Seder. Those of you who watched my interview with Mark Gerson and his book, The Telling, know some of those other things that you can say at the Seder. But we are going to concentrate on a few questions and issues that are both about the Seder and about Passover in general, its deeper philosophical significance, as well as some of the rituals and what they mean. So the beginning of the Pesach story, of course, is the descent into Egypt. And that's woven into the fabric of the Genesis story. Jews go down to Egypt initially because of a crime, right? The reason they go down to Egypt initially is because they've sold their brother Joseph there, and that's why they stay. I mean, they go back down also because of a famine. So there is natural disaster and there is human disaster in the eventual result of the people in slavery. That's why the Haggadah says, "Matchil b'genut u'mesayem b'shavach." We begin in disgrace or in humiliation and end in praise, praise or goodness or something like that. So once that happens, and the Israelites are down there, the way that it is calculated, according to most biblical authorities, is actually not 400 years of slavery. It's 400 years total in Egypt, and it's about 210 years of slavery, but 400 is the number that is usually used. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to give you a hard time if you go with the 400 number. But then we come, of course, to the liberation, and the liberation is entirely supposed to be God's gift in some ways to the Jewish people once they cry out to God and say, we're suffering and we need help and relief from this slavery. So the classical read of the Pesach story, which is what we've heard again and again and again, is it is a story of slaves who are freed. But we know that it's much more complicated than that, because first of all, there is the fact that they're not freed just to do whatever they want. They're freed to go into the desert to receive the Torah. So they are freed from the servitude of Pharaoh to the servitude of God. And second, because they themselves resist freedom and say, we want to go back to Egypt, on and on. And so there are both aspects to this. There is the human desire for servitude and the human desire for freedom, and God's eventual insistence that they be free. Now, when you get to the Seder itself, you have this meal, the only meal that I know of that has a table of contents, right? Kadesh, Rachatz, Karpas, Yachatz, all the things that we sing, and we sing the table of contents. We sing a lot at the Seder. But the paradox of having a meal that celebrates freedom that has a table of contents is the inbuilt paradox of the Pesach holiday, that all freedom requires order, that you cannot be free with disorder, that if there are no traffic signal, or if nobody obeys traffic signals, you can't be free to drive down the highway because there will be chaos. And freedom is a balance between chaos and control. It isn't just one or the other, and it's a constant balance. The other theme of the Pesach Seder, and I want to hit a few of them, is the breaking of the middle matzah. And the breaking of the middle matzah is really rich with beautiful symbolism. First of all, it's a symbol of the broken world and the fact that we all struggle with the brokenness of this world. And then the brokenness is hidden, right? The afikomen gets hidden. And that's also true, that we try to hide the brokenness of the world. We try to pretend it's not there. And then children bring it to light because the children find the afikomen. And that is often the case. The children bring to light, sometimes by their very existence, sometimes by their questions, they bring to light the brokenness of the world. And because they give the afikomen over to be eaten at the end, they help heal it. So it's not only order and disorder, it's also the theme of children and what children mean to the Pesach Seder and to the entire enterprise. One of the reasons why you have the songs at the end, the Haggadah, Echad Miyodea, is of course to keep the children up for the entire Seder, so that they will know and understand their own part in not only the story, but also in healing the brokenness of the world. So we've talked before about matzah. I'll just give a quick recap. That matzah is the symbol of haste, and a slave is someone who can control his or her own time. And I can't exactly illustrate this for you very well, but those of you who are, you should forgive me, on Twitter or Facebook, can see I posted this on Twitter or Facebook with the actual letters. But it occurred to me yesterday and this morning that chametz and matzah, this has been noted before, are almost the same letters. The difference is between the chet and the hey. And the difference between a chet and a hey is a little space that the hey has. Matzah has a little space, right? That's the difference in the word of chametz and matzah, of leaven and unleavened. Also, if you make matzah, then it just takes a few seconds before it gets leavened, before it's no good anymore, which means both in space and in time, the difference between chametz and matzah is tiny. Very little things in space and in time can make a very large difference. And that's also part of the lesson of the Passover, is if you look at the difference in the wording between the wise son and the wicked son, it's a very little difference. But one puts himself outside the community of Israel, and the other asks from within the community. And all of these things are ways of conveying the essential message, which is a message that, that's really nice, by the way. I just want to say that Sarah Schechter from Ramstein Air Base in Germany. All those things are really essential messages. And this idea that a very small difference can make a very huge difference is a big part of the Pesach Seder and the Pesach story. The next thing that I want to go to is that there is the other most familiar, apart from matzah in some ways, is opening the door. And the opening the door has multiple significances. And I want to just tell you a little bit about several of them. One is, of course, waiting for Elijah. And for the Jewish people, waiting for the Messiah means waiting for the one who has not yet come. In Jewish history, every Messiah who has come is a false Messiah, because the Messiah has not yet come and the world is unredeemed. And that idea, yes, I'm eating during class. This is a breakfast class after all. And that idea that we live in an unredeemed world is very much part of the Pesach Seder, because we know as we open the door and look out on the world how much pain and suffering and disease and awfulness exists in the world that we all experience. And so opening the door is not only a way of welcoming in the Messiah, but it's also doing what Moses did when he looked out and saw the slavery of his fellow Israelites, which is it's affirming our witness to the world as we hope that redemption has come. I've told this story before, but I will tell it again. When I was a kid, my younger brother, Danny, who's now a rabbi in New York, he used to open the door for Elijah, because usually it's the youngest that does it. And each year, I won't go through all the tricks that my older brother, Paul, who's now a professor of ethics, by the way, he used to play tricks on my younger brother. But each year he would play a different kind of trick. One year he walked in, one year he put the dog out there, one year he leaned a broom against the door. But as Danny got older, Paul stopped playing tricks. And the reason he did was because Danny didn't any longer believe that Elijah might walk in. So the trick had lost its point. That is, we open the door, but we don't really believe in redemption the way we did. And that's something of a loss. And we ought to recognize that in some ways, especially this year, to be able to open the door without fear, because we've all been afraid to open our doors all year long because of the pandemic. To be able to open the door without fear is a kind of redemption. And it's very powerful to open the door and to say, I am here and I'm not afraid. Remember, also in the Middle Ages, Passover was a time of the blood libel, and Jews were afraid to open their doors then too, which is why you get the other part of opening the door, shvoch hamacha, which means pour out your wrath upon those who have laid waste to Israel. And although some have trouble with that, I like that passage for two reasons. One is because it is being faithful to our ancestors who suffered and to the anger, the very righteous and legitimate anger that they felt. And the second is because we're asking God to take vengeance, which means, God, don't make us take vengeance or do bad things. If people need to be punished, you do it. Take it out of our hands. And I think that in the end, that's a very humane way of viewing the possibility of people being punished for bad things in this world. So I don't have a problem with the Shvoch HaMacha. I also like the whole idea of opening the door, which this year has multiple significances as doors are beginning to be opened in our world, which have been shut for too much for too long. And then, in addition to the matzah, and in addition to the Seder, the actual order, and in addition to the redemption, Messiah, and the door, the one other big part of the Seder that I want to address are questions. And I have several things to say about questions. First of all, you'll notice that the Seder doesn't start with questions. It starts with statements and with the order and with the blessings. Because if you don't believe anything, then there's nothing to question. You have to start with certain beliefs. Then you can question them. You don't start by questioning. But once those have been established, then the Jewish tradition says, you must now question. And in my interview with Mark Gerson, he recounted a story that he'd heard from me years before that I've told many times about I. Rabbi, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, who in an interview in Haaretz towards the end of his life, someone said to him, who was the biggest influence in your life, biggest intellectual influence? And he didn't name any of his teachers. He said, my mother. I said, why your mother? And he said, because when I used to come home from Cheder, from Jewish religious school every day, she would say to me, Itzi, which was Yitzchak, did you ask any good questions today? And from that, he said, I learned that the key was to ask good questions. And the Seder provides us with good questions and does things in an unusual way in order to provoke even more questions. And questions open the world as opposed to answers just closing it. And so questions allow us to explore things that we otherwise would not understand or explore. And that's why the Seder begins with certain statements and then moves to questions. Just a couple more random observations that I wanted to mention. There's so much to say about the Seder, and one could go on and on. This past Shabbat, I talked about the fact that the famous statement is, B'chol dor vador, in every generation, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa me'eretz Mitzrayim. A person is supposed to see him or herself as though they went forward from the land of Egypt. And I want you to just think about the first part of that statement for a second. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves. In other words, knowing who you are, self-examination, self-exploration, that's part of this process. And so in order to see yourself as someone who went forth from Egypt, you first have to see yourself. This sort of spiritual endeavor is central to the Seder. And all around the table, we get to see ourselves and imagine what it is to be who we are now and who we might have been had we been born in a different time and a different place. So there are all of those things. There's lots more that we could talk about. There's, the three, for some people, the three matzot represent our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that, if that's true, then the 4 cups of wine represent Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? Our foremothers and forefathers are at the Seder along with us. And no other holiday that I am aware of has storytelling as an obligation. The central mitzvah of the Pesach Seder is to tell the story. And that is, the story is what keeps a people together. The national narrative. This is what has enabled Jews to survive for as long as they've survived, is that we have our story. And the Exodus is not our only story, but it's our central story. And that story and retelling that story and engaging with it in all sorts of ways is what allows all of us to be part of this people that has carried the story through the generations. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and ask for questions or comments. And part of being free is being able to ask questions. No question about it. That's right. Slaves don't get to ask questions. But you are free. So question away or comment away. Whatever you got. I will offer you while you're thinking about it something that the Berdichever said. Reb Lev Yitzchak of Berdichev. He said, "Why is it called Chag HaPesach and Chag HaMatzot?" And his answer is, remember, God sends the angel to Pasach, to jump over the houses of the Israelites. So Chag HaPesach is what the Israelites call it because of what God did, and Chag HaMatzot is matzah, making the matzah, is what God calls it because of what the Israelites did, which is a very nice idea. Thank you, Deborah, for that kind comment. I don't think there are any questions in the chat. So let me say a couple more things, and then if there are no questions, I will leave you to your Pesach cleaning. One of the things I want to say is, Moses is not mentioned in the Haggadah. in part because we want to emphasize the role of God and so on. But also the story of Moses is the reverse in some ways of a heroic story, because the usual heroic story is you find a commoner and he proves secretly to be a prince or a king. With Moses, he grows up a king, but he's secretly a commoner. And that says something about what Israel is. That is, it's not a nation of princes. It's an aristocracy of the good and of the learned. That's what it's supposed to be. And Moses becomes Moses because of his character, not because of his lineage, not because of his birth, not because he's born a king, because he's not. And it's a wonderful reversal of the usual mythological reveal, in fact, that we discover that Moses is no one special, except, of course, that he's someone very special. And so the crossing of the sea is, which has, by the way, it's as every mythological crossing of water has the birth analogy to it. But the crossing of the sea is something that happens in every generation. Not exactly, obviously, the same, but the reason that Michael Walzer wrote a book called Exodus and Revolution, and he talks about how people have continually taken from the Exodus this inspiration to work and fight for freedom, and they have because the notion of God being on the side of the slaves, right, and loving the oppressed, and this is the source of that we think of as sort of, that's of course the answer that all of us understand, but that's not necessarily true. Before the Exodus, it was not a normally understood reality. It was usually the good and the beautiful and the rich and the so on. They were favored by God, right? Pharaoh's favored by God, not the poor slaves who are favored by God. And so that reversal, just like the reversal of Moses, is a powerful one that teaches a spiritual lesson that is really enduring. Okay, what else can I tell you? Other than lots of other stuff, but for each element of the Seder, there is endless commentary. I advise you to get a good Haggadah that has commentary in it. I want to remind you again that there is no class next Thursday. We're going to take Pesach off of the daily videos and of the class just for Pesach. No, the first person who went into the water, according to the tradition, was Nachshon ben Aminadab, who jumped into the water when everybody else was afraid to. The first person who sang and who celebrated was a woman, and that was Miriam, who danced with the timbrels as they crossed to the other side. So that's Moses' sister. Also, the wells of water in the desert were in honor of Miriam, according to the tradition. So this is the story is. So Jim asked, the last time we saw Elijah was in a chariot, and he returns almost without fanfare. See, what's the significance of that? Well, the reason that he returns is because he doesn't die. That's why Elijah is the one who announces the coming of the Messiah, because Elijah doesn't die. And in fact, in the Talmud, interestingly, although he returns without fanfare, the rabbis were always bumping into Elijah and asking him questions about what's going on in heaven. I don't know. There are very different visions of the Messiah, which maybe we would have another class on, and what the Messiah would be, whether it would be a giant thing or a small thing, and whether the Messiah has powers beyond people or is just a person, which is the prevailing view. What it means that the lions will lay down with the lamb, is that literal? Is that figurative? Is that metaphorical? But I think here's what I will say about Elijah and Elijah's meaning, and this might be a very nice way to end. is what happens when Elijah comes back. Well, what happens when Elijah comes back is, according to the prophet Malachi, "Vehishit levavot al banim v'lev banim el avotam," that the hearts of parents will be turned to children and the hearts of children to their parents. And that means that if you're at a Seder where you're surrounded by family, whether virtually or in person, and it's a loving family, then you've participated in part of the Messianic age, because parents and children have turned their hearts to one another. And that idea is a beautiful and a powerful one. And I wish it for all of you, that you have that kind of Passover Seder, a Seder of peace, of love, of family, of goodness, of good food, and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Now, go clean some chametz.